Hello and welcome to Earth 911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable, carbon-neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. If the human population continues to rise on its current growth path, the World Resources Institute estimates that we'll need 56% more food without expanding farmlands, which are typically carved out of forested areas critical to reducing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Our guest today is Patricio Grassini. He is Sunkist Distinguished Professor of Agronomy at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the co-leader of the Global Yield Gap Atlas Project, the world's leading database describing 13 major food crops, how much they grow, and the optimal amount that they can grow if managed appropriately. The Global Yield Gap Atlas Project is also backed by the Gates Foundation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. So it's available to everybody in the world to use. Patricio has published 8 studies in Nature and other journals over the past decade about the potential to close crop yield gaps, the difference between what is currently grown and the potential maximum output for each crop and the land used to grow it. He argues that yield gaps in rice, maize, that's corn for us in the United States, palm oil, and soy, as well as other legumes, can be closed using today's existing farmland with more intensive use of land. That could be by increasing cropping intensity, planting more crops or multiple crops over the course of the year, by improving pest control and using fertilizer appropriately. Most farmers use too much fertilizer. And what we know is that pesticides have sterilized many soils, and fertilizer contributes 1.4% of the world's annual CO2 emissions. We've harmed our soil, groundwater, and waterways with the way that we currently grow all of our food. So we need to explore the trade-offs available to improve crop yields while preserving the environment, and how to change farming to restore soil health globally in today's conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. You can learn more about the Global Yield Gap Atlas at www.yieldgap, that's one word, no space, no dash, yieldgap.org. Welcome to the show, Patricio. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the invite, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining us. I've been reading your studies in Nature, not just because of this interview, but I happen to have read them in the past. How do you characterize the state of agriculture today? Do you see us as really preparing for the changes necessary to feed the world while keeping the world inhabitable?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Mitch. I think that we are facing something that humanity has never faced before, in the sense of trying to meet our future food demand and trying to do it in the most sustainable way possible. So if you ask me about the status of our trajectories in food production now, I would say that we are in a very unsustainable pathway. Mm-hmm. When you look at our rates of expansion of cropland every year, they are just very high. We are expanding our agricultural area at a rate of nearly 13 million hectares of cropland per year. So every year, there are a new 13 million hectares that are brought into agriculture. And why is that happening? That's happening because of a combination of food demand not being met, which leading to high prices, which makes many areas that before may not have been suitable for agriculture suddenly becoming profitable for that activity, and therefore allowing expansion into areas that before were hosting other ecosystems such as peatlands, wetlands, or forests. So we are, at the same time, we are expanding our cropland area at rates never seen before. Also, it's worrisome to see that our rates of yield improvement, that means the crop productivity per unit of land, are not increased as fast as they should increase in order to meet our future food demand. So we have a combination here of our rates of crop productivity not increasing fast enough, high crop prices, and increasing our cropland area faster than ever before. So the present picture is not that optimistic.
Okay, I that's discouraging to hear, but unfortunately, we hear it all the time. Now, you focus on yield gaps, the difference between what could be grown in a given uh, unit of land and what is actually grown, which it appears based on reading the research over the years, we never really get close to 100% yield or possible yield. How did the Global Yield Gap Atlas, the site and information system that you've helped launch, get started, and who's using it?
Well, it's because the motivation of trying to guide sustainable intensification define us trying to produce as much food as we can on existing cropland area, try to do it in a way it is sensitive to soil, water, and air resources, but at the end of the day to try to mitigate or at least reduce the need for expanding our agricultural areas into natural ecosystems. If we want to be successful at doing that, then we need to increase yields. And the next question is where we can increase yield further. And that leads us to the yield gap, which is basically the difference between what a farmer is attaining now on his or her fields compared with what can be potentially produced there based on the weather, soil type, and so forth. And therefore, understanding where those yield gaps are larger is important because it's telling us or help us to identify areas where it's possible to produce more food on existing cropland area without need to expand into new environments. Now, and that's the motivation to start with this global atlas of yield gaps, which basically maps these productivity gaps for all major food crop systems around the world.
So do primarily policymakers or Farm Bureau people who would then communicate you could do better to the farmers use the Yield Gap Atlas, or are farmers actually going in there and saying, I wonder how I'm doing compared to what I could?
Well, in a way you already said, but yes, the Atlas is visited by a wide range of stakeholders, all the way from individual farmers who want to benchmark themselves in terms of how far they are from their potential productivity, to national governments that are interested to understand where they will be able to feed themselves in the future, or they will need to rely on expensive food imports or aid.
And that's another important component of the Atlas, which is the economic impact that the current farmland or any additional farmland will have on the country's GDP. You always consistently call this out in your research, that it's not just the feeding us, it's the fact that for a country like Brazil, their export of soybeans and beef is also important to their economy. And you can't just make these changes without a lot of social unrest. Your research talks about the idea of whether or not we are on a plateau or we're waiting for the next innovation, like the one that 70 years ago started the Green Revolution when Norman Borlaug introduced high-yielding, disease-resistant wheat and other things like commercial fertilizer became available. Are we stuck in the current model in some sense and waiting for a transition moment, or is there a technology or something coming that you expect to help us move from the lower yield to the highest possible yield?
All right. Well, let me first go back to your first point about this dual challenge of developing countries to try to produce more, but in a way in which it doesn't destroy the last bastions of forests and wetlands in the world. We need to be sensitive to the economic aspirations of many of these countries, because they also want to develop economically, and they have there, vast tracts of land that are not used for any economic activity, and therefore that, not using those means an opportunity cost. And that's why we believe that besides telling these countries not to do something like encroaching natural ecosystems, we also need to bring things to the solutions table, and for example, hey, you can produce more on existing cropland area because your yield gaps are huge. So maybe you can meet both economic and environmental goals if you focus on trying to produce more with existing cropland and water resources rather than expanding into new areas. So that's point number one. And then point number two about, you refer to the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution was very successful in the sense that with very simple technological packages like seeds, fertilizer, and pesticides, during the 60s and 70s and early 80s, farmers were able to sustain a huge increase in productivity with very simple packages of technologies that will work pretty well across the board. Now, the Green Revolution in a way vanished because, after you try seeds, you try nitrogen, phosphorus, pesticides, then further yield increases becomes increasingly more difficult and rely more on interaction between factors and more tailored recommendations. So if we really want to tailor a new green revolution that is effective at increasing yield while at the same time protecting the environment, then I think that we need to move into an agriculture that is more knowledge-based rather than input-based, so that we can help farmers to exploit those interactions among production factors, and also try to do that in a way in which is sensitive to the environment, so we minimize any side effects such as nitrogen leaching, overuse of pesticides, and so forth. So that's why we refer to a new and greener green revolution. It's about trying to extend the previous green revolution, but also learning from the mistakes that we made, so that the next one or the continuation of the previous one can be sensitive to both production and environmental goals.
Now, there's several different questions that came to mind from what you just said, and let me go through a couple of them. What if we did successfully put a price on carbon so that those utilized lands had value and was generating value? Do you think that would help drive policymakers in emerging economies to be more sustainable in their land use choices?
Maybe. I mean, I can, I'm not an astrologist and I'm an agronomist, but the fact is that there is very little hope for forests and wetlands when we go through a cycle of very high crop prices in a context of low land prices. So when the crop commodity prices are very high in places like Brazil or Indonesia or other countries where land is not necessarily that expensive and enforcement and regulation are not so strong, then there is very little hope to protect those forests. So at the end of the day, yes, what you mentioned may work or may not work, but at the end of the day, what we know is that the worst enemy for the forest is high crop prices. And the only way to avoid high crop prices is to make sure that the production exceeds demand, and that helps to avoid or at least mitigate the high fluctuation in crop prices that we see these days. Without being able to produce more than what is demanded, then crop prices will remain high. We will go through price spikes, and it's during those cycles of crop spikes of crop price spikes that it's very, very difficult to avoid those massive cycles of cropland expansion that you see around.
So what I hear you saying is that carbon pricing isn't a silver bullet in any stretch of the imagination. It's more a matter of what are the current regional market dynamics, both food prices, price of land, and so forth, that would drive the expansion of deforestation or other destroying wetlands, for instance.
Well, I'm not saying that it's not going to work. I'm saying that it's still to be seen. It's still to be seen.
I agreed, and by not a silver bullet, I mean it's not.
Sure.
You can't flip a switch. It's much more complicated than that.
Sure, of course.
Now, the other thing is the green revolution had some downsides. Sure. Soil biome loss, eutrophication from nitrogen fertilizers in the waterways. How does the next green revolution and greener, I love that phrase, but next and greener green revolution, how does that differ from the revolution that we are still benefiting from?
Okay, I want to make 2 points. The first one is that, yes, there were many unintended side effects coming from the green revolution that were negative to the environment. But having said that, something that people sometimes forget to see is that thanks to the green revolution, we were able to increase our crop production many times and do that without too much expansion in cropland area. So for nearly 30 years, we were able to multiply several times our crop production without increasing our cropland area. So when you look in terms of land savings and the associated carbon savings, that probably more than offset any additional environmental impact due to increasing use of inputs and pesticides and so forth. Now, having said, yes, in many cases there were overuse of nutrients and pesticides, creating many important local problems in the environment. And in a way, the way to go about that is what I described before. We need to learn from those mistakes. Mm-hmm. And we need to move from blanket recommendations across the board to more tailored recommendations to each environment that are more knowledge-based rather than input-based, so that we make sure that besides promoting greater use of an input or not, we also pay more emphasis on maintaining or increasing the efficiency in the use of those inputs. Because at the end of the day, Mitch, for a farmer that use more inputs than what is really needed, that also has an economic penalty. So I don't see too much trade-off between economics and environment, because at the end of the day, a farmer who saves nitrogen from bee leach is a farmer who also saves money from fertilizer.
Exactly. So
we need to move to an agriculture that is more knowledge-based and it's not only centered on inputs.
And so that next green revolution could be more regenerative and so forth, where you're spending less on the inputs to the system because you are using a knowledge-based approach. That's very promising when I think about it, because we're also saying to the farmers, you could make more money and without having to farm more land.
True. That's so true. And these days you hear all kind of new agricultural terms like regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture. There's, you can call it however you want. At the end of the day, we're talking about good agronomy. And something that to me is, I think that is missing in the discussion, is that we spend a lot of time trying to think how we are going to get to a place or how we are going to get to the promised land of agriculture without first trying to define how that promised land should look like. And I think that we should try to pay a little bit more of efforts in trying to define 4 or 5 things that will define, according to our knowledge, a sustainable cropping system. And that could be, for example, closing the yield gap. That could be preserving carbon and nitrogen stocks in the soils. That could be integrated pest management. That could be preserving biodiversity. But to me, it's very important to define first how that agricultural promised land should look like. And once we have defined that, then we discuss how to get there. And all these disciplines or new approaches or proposals can be assessed through the length of those metrics or of those indicators that we have defined as being part of that sustainable cropping system. To me, it's more important to first define where we want to get and then start the discussion about how we get there. Otherwise, it's very, very easy to get lost in the discussion about that.
I think that's a great point. I want to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back to continue the conversation. And we're back to talk more with Patricio Grassini. He's the sun-kissed Distinguished Professor of Agronomy at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and co-leader of the Global Yield Gap Atlas Project. Patricio, I think you made an incredibly important point just before we took the break about the fact that we need to define where we're going. But do we really understand where we are today? And that's why I find the Global Yield Gap Atlas so fascinating. How well do we understand our agronomy system today?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think that we are spending enough time trying to benchmark where we are now. The Global Yield Gap is one of the few projects that have attempt to try to benchmark cropping systems in terms of their performance in using land, water, and other resources to produce food. So we know that we are not on a sustainable pathway, but perhaps more importantly, we don't know exactly where opportunities exist to improve yield, to improve resources efficiency, or both. For example, our recent study on rice gaps at a global level shows that it will be kind of easy to meet future rice demand on existing cropland area if we focus, for example, on 30% of the area where we know that the large yield gaps are, and we can do it, and all the nitrogen surplus can be almost eliminated by reducing nitrogen inputs on another 30% of the area where rice is grown now, where we know that the farmers are applying way more nitrogen than what the plants actually need. So that's the kind of research that we need. We need research that help us to orient our investments on research and extension programs and inform our policy so we can make more informed decisions about where we can increase yields, where we can be more efficient in the use of inputs, or both, and where. To me, the key question is where, and what's the associated timeline to do that.
Do you see government truly understanding and getting engaged with the need to drive sustainable agriculture as you do your research and as you talk to various farmers and policymakers around the world? Are they engaged?
Well, depending where. I think that, we talked about the Green Revolution before, and the Green Revolution was great. But besides the environmental impact, it also has another unintended effect, which was that it made us forget about the importance of producing enough food and affordable. During the 80s, 90s, we were producing too much food. Actually, the problem was that we were producing too much food and the prices were just too low. At the same time, that was very good because it helped us to keep our agricultural on existing problem. Now, the problem when you have too much food and the price of food is low is then you don't feel the pressure to invest on programs to improve crop productivity, and you have more degrees of freedoms in terms of failure and success. If you fail, but you're producing so much and it's so cheap, then what's the consequence of that? So for many years, for many decades after the Green Revolution, I feel like we have not necessarily investing correctly on research and extension programs to try to keep to maintain the Green Revolution over time. I think that now we are facing at different times. Agriculture is faced to the front cover of the newspapers. Recent cycles of high crop prices have put agriculture back into that agenda. And I trust that governments in any parts of the world and donors are now looking more closely at this issue of food security and its interconnection with environmental issues and land use change.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the fact that we were in a glut state for 20 to 30 years, but really that's what you're describing. Let me ask about a specific country, and it's a place you've done research. You did you published an article in December 2022 in Nature about sustainability in Brazil and the fact that economic growth and environmental goals can be managed in such a way that they don't have to continue to tear down the Amazon. There's a lot of complexity to the Brazilian political environment. Of course, President Bolsonaro, now voted out of office, was aggressively deforesting the Amazon. Today, President Lula is there. Does Brazil have the institutions and policies and enforcement capability that you talk about in the article to achieve sustainable agriculture while preserving critically important biomes in the world?
Well, the new administration made clear that they have as a main goal to slow down deforestation, the recent high deforestation rates that we have been seeing in Brazil.
It's a goal, though, but do they have capacity to do it?
But to me, answering your question, I just don't know. But here is the new thing, the new trend. I think that pressure should come from the demand side. So, because when you think about who consumes all the soybean that Brazil produces? Not the Brazilians.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that if we are really worried about this issue of the deforestation, then countries who import soybean from Brazil then should start to ask that all that soybean comes from deforestation-free areas. And that would be very easy to do, with a very strong certification program. And some of those certification programs exist, but they're just not enough, to prevent deforestation. And to me, what is missing there is intensification, because you cannot just countries not to do something. You also have to provide them with a pathway to try to produce more with what they have now. But I'm optimistic that within 1-2 years, if they're really conscious and serious about, with a strong focus on intensifying production on the cropland that they have now, together with strong institutions and law enforcement, they can do that. They can do it. In 1-2 years, Brazil can eliminate deforestation if they want, especially if that's coupled with some sort of pressure from the demand side. The people who buy soybean from Brazil, like the European Union, they also start to put more and more pressure, increasing pressure about, okay, we want this soybean, we want to import your crop commodity, but we also want to make sure that they come from areas in which there is no encroachment of forest. That would be a complete different war, Mitch, if you think about if countries only start to buy food from places where there is no deforestation.
Well,
Yeah.
That raises the whole question of certification, and you mentioned it, certification programs. And we've covered trying to identify Brazilian soy in U.S. products a number of times, and it's hard. The idea of provenance, which I end up talking to almost all our guests about these days, is becoming important to enable the demand side to say, well, this is what we actually want, not that stuff you're selling. We want this. Have you collaborated with organizations seeking to do that kind of certification? Because it seems like that's a natural extension of the Yield Gap Atlas.
Yes, we have been doing that, not necessarily in Brazil, but we have been doing that in Indonesia with all palm. As you know, all palm is another very controversial crop because it's driving deforestation and conversion of peatlands for palm oil production, which, by the way, is a major source of vegetable oil in the world. Now, there is a very strong certification program on place, but as always happens, what we are finding is that the certification program by itself is not enough. And it's not sensitive to the economic aspirations of countries and farmers to produce more and make more profit. So a usual recommendation at the end of every paper that I write about these issues is that all these programs that certify things and tells farmers what not to do, they also should come together with a package of alternatives, offering farmers, governments ways to try to improve their productivity, their production, but doing it in a way in which they make use of the land resources that are under production now, rather than trying to expand into the new acre of forest or peatlands. So to me, the key here, Mitch, is try to convey the message that we need to be sensitive to the economic aspirations of countries. And to do so is necessary not only to tell them what not to do, but also to tell them what they can do to produce more with the land that they have now under cultivation.
It's interesting. I mean, we find that here in the United States that farmers who are told they can't do something rebel. Farmers who are told, we'll pay you to do this, are happy as clams to get involved with sustainability. One of the things I found interesting about your research across the board was you tend to look at the next 20 to 30 years, and understandably, because you're also looking at the economic impacts. But have you looked at what happens in the second half of the century for crop yields if we don't stay within the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway? What's your prognosis for the food supply in the second half of the century?
Yeah, the reason why we look at typically at the next 20, 30 years is because we know that population will peak around or slightly after the year 2050, and that will coincide more or less with a peak in food demand. So in terms of agricultural and food security, the next 20, 30 years are crucial, because demand is the food supply versus demand is going to be very, very tight, and that could lead to very high crop prices, fluctuations, social unrest, and massive land conversion. So the next 20, 30 years from the perspective of food production, food security, and land use conversion is crucial. And land use conversion is critical because land conversion due to agriculture accounts for nearly 25% of climate change. So if you really care about climate change, you need to pay attention to land conversion, and you need to make sure that to do everything you can to mitigate land conversion, or at least minimize it to a level that is feasible. And the way to do that is by producing more on existing cropland area. The only way to avoid massive land conversion is to try that farmers get to that 80-90% of the yield potential and try to produce as much as possible on every single acre of land that is currently in production, and doing in a way is sensitive to the environment. Now, another reason why we look at the next 20, 30 years is because we know that typically the effect of climate change that is being predicted is going to be on crops, is going to be more serious in the second half of the century rather than during the first one. And the reason for that is because in the short, midterm, farmers can adapt to climate change through a combination of management practices, new genetics, and so forth. So that's why in most cases we are predicting that the impact of climate change on crop yields is likely to be minimum until 2050. But having said that, if we continue on the trajectory of temperature increase, then it's likely that those adaptation measurements are not going to be enough during the second half of the century, and therefore that will even put more pressure,
Sure.
try to increase yields, in a context of climate change.
Are there specific crops that you think are at significant risk in the second half of the century in terms of rising temperatures? And are there solutions such as new genetics for variants that do better in heat?
In relation to your first point, I think that all the crops are sensitive to
all of them. Oh, that's great news.
Are very sensitive and will be affected by increasing temperature. Now, in some areas of the world, for example, here in Nebraska, climate change may have some positive effects in the sense that may extend the length of the growing season, and therefore it may be possible to grow crops with longer cycle that produce more. Or in some areas that where currently double cropping is not possible, maybe in the future with warming weather, it will be possible to grow 2 crops instead of 1. So there will be some compensation there. But overall, in terms of individual crops, the effect of warming is going to be negative, no question about that. Now, in relation to how we can adapt to climate change, well, as I said before, one adaptation could be to try to grow more crops on the same piece of land in a context of warming weather. At the same time, continuous breeding and improvement in management practices will allow some level of adaptation. But over the long term, it's really exploring new territory, because we are going to go into environments that crops have never explored before. So it's going to require a high level of innovations. Something that can be explored is, for example, try to understand, for example, how Nebraska will look in 50 years, 60 years down the road, and if there are environments now that currently look like Nebraska in 50, 60 years down the road, and try to see, what farmers do on those environments, so that maybe farmers in Nebraska can learn from those farmers that are farming now in the environment that will look like Nebraska in the future. So that's the kind of thing that we can try to do to adapt to climate change. But having said that, there is a high dose of uncertainty in relation to how, Nebraska and any place in the world will look in 50 years. So we're kind of adapting to something that we don't know actually how it's going to look like. So it's going to be challenging, but from an agronomic perspective, it's a big challenge. And that puts a lot of pressure on the new generations of agronomists and the need for to interact with other disciplines to try to meet this challenge of producing more in a context of warming weather.
Now, the other issue that we are all concerned about is the availability of water and sea level rise, which is the opposite. It's too much water and the wrong kind. I've read that 23.4% of the world's agricultural land is potentially at risk from sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. Would a region like Asia be able to produce enough rice if it lost a significant percentage of its farmland? Is that kind of flexibility in the system like you described earlier?
Maybe yes or maybe not, but for sure, if you cut down 10% of the current rice production in Asia, then that will eliminate any capacity of that region to export rice to other places of the world that import rice, like Africa, or will increase the price. So at the end of the day, I mean, besides the question whether or not there will be sufficient rice for Asia, which is an important question by itself, then the next question is who is gonna produce all the rice that, for example, Algeria or Nigeria needs, and that Africa imports 40% of the rice they consume, and most of that rice comes from Southeast Asia. So if Southeast Asia cannot export rice anymore, where is the rice for Africa going to come from? So as you can see, the global food system now is so interconnected, and countries depend so much on trade, that what happens in Asia will have implications for the whole world, not only for that region by itself.
What does an informed citizen need to know about the trajectory of the food supply? What questions would you suggest somebody ask? And this goes to the demand side. What should they be asking for?
Well, I think as a society and as a discipline, we should be asking how we should prioritize our research and extension efforts to feed the world in the next 30 years, and doing it in a way in which we don't destroy the last acres of forests and peatlands that we have in the world. And to do that, we need to be smart, and we need to understand that there is no more degrees of freedom to play with, and that the timeline is very tight. And if we make a conscious effort to define where we want to be in 2050, and we invest on those existing technologies, that we know that are well proven, that work at trying to bring us to that promised land, then I'm very optimistic that we can make it. Now, if we are going to invest, if we are going to bet on horses that we don't know if they have any chance to win, then I'm not so optimistic. So I think that it's time to smart up and invest on the technologies that we know that are going to be effective in taking to the cropping system that we want in 30 years on the road.
Do you think that the certification programs that we talked about a little bit before would be key to helping consumers send the signal, this is what I want?
Yes, but by itself it's not sufficient.
What else do we need?
Yeah, we need to, as I said before, we need a conscious effort for at global, national, and regional levels to increase the productivity of our crop systems. Without an explicit effort to increase the rate at which we increase our crop yields, it's going to be difficult to keep our forests there for the next generation.
Well, Patricio, that's both very informative and kind of discouraging to hear. How can our listeners follow your work? Because you're doing such important stuff.
Yeah, but before, I don't want to leave a note of pessimism.
Okay.
I'm optimistic, but we need to be serious and we need to be explicit about the need to intensify our crop systems. And we don't have that much time, because this is going to happen in the next 30 years. I'm optimistic that we can meet the challenge, but we need to be serious and explicit about promoting crop sustainable intensification, so that every single acre of land produces near its potential and makes best use of land, water, and fertilizer resources. And in relation to your question, if users are interested to learn about my program, they can always check on the Global Yield Gap Atlas website, www.yieldgap.org, where users can find information about the current status of cropping systems, trajectories, and where opportunities exist to produce more on existing cropland and with existing water resources.
Patricio, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It has been a pleasure to talk with you.
We've been talking with Patricio Grassini. He is the co-leader of the Global Yield Gap Atlas Project and Sunkist Distinguished Professor of Agronomy at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You can find out about the Global Yield Gap Analysis at www.yieldgap. Yield gap is one word, no space, no dash. Yieldgap.org. And if you have a nature.com subscription, Patricio's research is available there, and it's fascinating. It's something that I actually track and read. So, what did we learn? Smarter agricultural decisions, from the field to government policy to the choices we make at the grocery store, are required to increase the availability of food while preserving forests and wetlands that serve as critical carbon sinks for the planet. The good news is that we have far more data today than even a decade ago about the state of our land, crop production, weather, and myriad other factors. Now, the challenge is to rapidly translate that data into useful information. And there is progress on the certification front as well. For example, U.S. soy producers have launched a set of requirements for responsible organic growing practices in the United States. That certification, known as the Sustainably Grown Soy label, hasn't come to market yet. It's currently in trials, but it's one of many future certifications that we may be able to use to make better decisions at retail when we're shopping. With more labels come more choices, and we can learn more about our food, where it's grown, how it's grown, and the distance it's shipped to make better decisions about our environmental impact when we eat. As Patricio said, global demand for food is expected to peak around 2050. If we can grow food sustainably enough to conserve our forests and wetlands between now and 2050, the pressure to convert them for agricultural use could pass. But of course, any positive outcomes in the second half of the 21st century will depend on staying within or very close to the Paris Accord goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And every one of us needs to help reduce carbon emissions. So, folks, I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this show and any of the other episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear with your friends, family, coworkers, your boss. Let's get people talking about these ideas. You're the amplifiers that spread them, and that's how we're going to achieve a less wasteful world. If you want to make a big impact, please leave a review of the show. We'd love to get people talking about this. Let everyone know that we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other places that you go to find podcast goodness. We appreciate your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, Folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.